We're back here on Jones and Company, and Senator Mitchell is our guest on the program today. Senator, the situation in Venezuela is breaking the hearts of millions of people. Millions have moved out of Venezuela. People aren't able to get food and medical attention. And there are many governments in the Western Hemisphere that have decided not to support the current president, Maduro. The Bahamas took a particular position at the OAS, and then I saw a release from the Prime Minister's office saying that, you know, our policy of non-intervention remains the same.
Yeah, we really chuckled at that one.
Yeah.
Because when I was foreign minister, I met in place a policy that essentially said you stayed out of the internal affairs of a country. And of course, one is concerned about the human rights of people, about the ability to get food, about the economy of Venezuela, about oppression and all the rest of it. But we have diplomatic relations with the Maduro government. We haven't broken diplomatic relations with them. We saw that an election result took place. So de facto, he's the person in charge. Some states took it upon themselves to reach into Venezuela and say, we're no longer going to support that person. We're going to support the leader of the opposition. So take the equivalent position. That would be like Mr. Davis getting up tomorrow and saying, I am now the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, and you should recognize me. And other states says, yeah, we agree with that, and we're going to do that. Well, everybody here would think that that's a wrong result because it doesn't actually reflect the institutional position. So the position has always been the governments of the Bahamas to refrain from getting involved in these matters, the internal affairs of the country. So when it wasn't a vote, but when the decision was taken to express the view that the opposition should be supported in contradistinction to the government, we said, hang on a second here. Can you explain? I mean, you may have cogent reasons for doing so, but can you explain to us why the Bahamas government is taking the position? And particularly since the back chat was obvious that the public officials in the ministry had advised against it. So fast forward to the last statement. I got from one of my Caribbean colleagues a copy of a letter which was written by the Prime Minister to the Secretary General. And one paragraph in the letter just stood out to me. The Bahamas position is non-interference in the affairs of other countries and a whole lot of other things in the list. So again, we had to say, well, what's going on here? On the one hand, you say you're going to reach into the country and you're going to support the leader of the opposition. And now you say you support this conference of neutral parties in Uruguay that's going to take place in Uruguay. And you are going to support the principle of non-interference. It just comes off as a bit
Are you clear on what the government's position is?
Well, the letter is written by the Prime Minister, so I'm assuming that the Prime Minister speaks for the government, and it comes off, I say, as a repudiation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs position. How that can happen, I don't know, because it would have been impossible for that to happen under the administration of Perry Christie. It couldn't happen because the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs spoke as one. So.
And so you are suggesting that the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister are not speaking as one.
Well,
but you would take the position of the Prime Minister.
Well, he speaks for the country. He speaks for the country, not the Foreign Minister. When the Foreign Minister speaks, unless he's superseded by the Prime Minister. Now, they might want to have their cake and eat it too, because there's a similar issue in Jamaica. Jamaica also signed on to this non-interference, but they also say, our colleagues in the opposition in the Caribbean, they're equally as confused as to where everyone is. What we suspect happened, of course, is that there was pressure put on them by the United States to vote in a particular direction, and our foreign policy today is whatever the U.S. says.
So our policy right now is confused on Venezuela.
I think so, and on a whole number of other fronts. But that one just sticks out like a sore thumb.
Mr. Mitchell, I know you you're probably cognizant of it. What has been the impact of, for example, Venezuela on Trinidad?
Trinidad has a very curious relationship with Venezuela, as does Guyana. You know, the issue of the territorial issues and the question of who owns what under the sea. But Raleigh, Prime Minister Raleigh, has been very strong on this point. He, in fact, built and led the consensus in CARICOM that we will not interfere in the internal affairs of Venezuela. Trinidad is one of the progenitors of the conference, which is supposed to be held in Uruguay. But I see where the Americans announced yesterday, they brought this man, Elliot Abrams, in from one of the old regimes, who is quite a right-wing fellow. And he has said that the time for talking to Maduro is done, unless it is talking about how he's going to leave Venezuela. I mean, this is sort of extraordinary talk. The man is a citizen of Venezuela. So when we were looking at this, I was saying to colleagues that, you know, it looks to me like Aristide revisited. You know, we sat through that whole era when essentially the American government told us, you know, Aristide is going. We're not going to extend the protection that we did before. We'll find a safe place for him to go, and that's it. So it looks like the fix is in. I mean, the Bank of England, for example, which is supposed to be a place where it's safe to put your reserves, when the government of Venezuela tried to transfer the gold reserves, I think some $8 billion from the Bank of England, they refused to carry out the instructions, saying that they didn't recognize Maduro, they recognized the leader of the opposition. I mean, this is, you know, quite extraordinary. So it just looks as if there's a new sort of tightening, and we'll see what happens. Yeah.
How do you read the China connection to this?
Well, the Chinese have always said, you know, non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, except that China does not have the reach that the United States has.
Yes, in this region, right, in this hemisphere,
and neither does Russia.
Yeah.
So it's good for them to, I suppose, take a moral position. But you know what I think is very curious is just before John Kerry left office as Secretary of State, he gave a speech to the Organization of American States, and he essentially pronounced the Monroe Doctrine as dead.
Yeah. As dead?
As dead, yeah. He said, look, the era of us interfering in countries, that's done. And we want to work, going forward, we want to work with countries going forward. Well, clearly, that is out the window. And the whole issue that many countries, of course, are asking themselves, particularly after you see what happened in Syria, is whether or not you have a reliable ally. Can you depend on the United States as a reliable ally?
What is, because we seem to be a country who is xenophobic, myopic, what do you see the role of international affairs in the public policy of the Bahamas?
Well, the two are twinned together. Our investments, climate and trade policy, and foreign policy are twinned together. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, quite apart from its ability to smooth the passage of Bahamians traveling around the world, because remember, that was my mantra. My mantra was I wanted that passport, that Bahamian passport, to be able to get Bahamians everywhere around the world without visa restrictions and requirements.
Still can't go to Australia.
Yes, I understand, you know, but that was my, so that's point number one. Point number two, though, is to support trade. Now, we were engaged in an outreach to the United Arab Emirates and to Qatar during our time. I think Qatar has sort of gone dead. UAE, they're still moving toward the Expo 2020. But one of the things that these countries require for investment in our country is a couple of things: the double taxation treaty and an investment protection treaty. And we have been very slow to get these things done. And investment protection is really a treaty which says that you're not going to expropriate their property if they invested here. I mean, people have come here, they've been very impressed by it, so on and so forth. So that is, in my view, the role of foreign policy and international trade, is to make this an atmosphere where people want to invest and they know that it is a safe place to invest. I mean, the country has a good reputation as it is, but there are certain technical things which have to be put in place.
Talking about trade, some people are talking about WTO.
The favorite letters in the alphabet.
Yeah, some people are not. Some people just simply do not understand it.
Yeah.
And the Progressive Liberal Party has a position on it.
Right.
And what is that position?
That position is, at this point, the government should pause and get more consultations on the views of the Bahamian public before they advance, particularly given the fact that the U.S. is in a position where it appears to want to withdraw from it. So you know what direction it's going to take.
So you want a public that doesn't understand WTO to give the government a position on it?
Well, no, I'm saying that we described it as taking the temperature of the public.
Yeah, but the public can't give you a temperature because the average Bahamian is a little confused about it, more than a little confused. They are oblivious to what you're even seeking to do with WTO.
Well, there are 4 points that we raised. We said it's the government's responsibility to do the public education, not the PLP's responsibility. Yeah. And we've done what we did, which was, it was taken up, an offer was given. The offer was never prosecuted. So we're looking, and what we said is, until the government actually settles what the offer is, there's nothing for us to say. Nothing for us to say. And if you want to reduce WTO down to its essence, of course, WTO is simply a customs agreement, which is to lower customs duties. And then the question is, how do you make up the revenue from the loss of customs duties? The fact is, of course, that the country is already WTO compliant in so many ways.
Wouldn't you say that it's simply not in the interests of the Bahamas at this time to join the WTO as a full member?
Well, that's not for me to say. I'm saying when the government makes an offer, we'll tell you what the position is.
All right.
The party's position is what it is.
On Haiti, Mr. Mitchell, we've seen the number of people who perished in the shipwreck the other day. They're still finding bodies. The Haitian government and the Bahamian government apparently have not been able to come together to deal and to come up with ways and means to decrease this migration out of Haiti.
It's perplexing to all of us, to all citizens, and certainly perplexing to us, how you can get all the way up to Abaco without being spotted.
Yes.
How you can even get all the way into almost to the mouth of the base here in New Providence and not get stopped by these boats. And we keep hearing these reports that 5 out of the 9 boats that we just bought are not working, they're not functional. That the logistical expertise and capabilities of the Defense Force are not what they ought to be. You don't want to sort of beat a drum beat on that too much, because you don't want to be saying negative things about the Defense Force, but it perplexes the public. And the thing is, there's human lives are being lost as a result of it. I don't think that the Haitian government has the capacity to do anything to stop it. I think we have better and greater capacity, but I don't think the capacity is being utilized. And of course, foreign affairs has been downgraded to such an extent in this administration that you actually don't know what they're doing from day to day and whether or not they have any impact at all on the situation.
How has it been downgraded, foreign affairs?
Well, you just have to have someone do an examination of the journal files and see how many times you've heard from the foreign minister in the last year. And that should tell you something. Silence must be golden.
But Mr. Mitchell, isn't that the job of the opposition to do that?
Do what?
Make the public aware when ministries are ineffective,
well,
or departments are ineffective?
That's what we do. No question. Yeah, no question. But
what you're saying here today about the Defense Force is is mind-boggling. We not aware of these things.
No, well, I mean, I can show you the statements. This is what I'm saying. You know, I get the impression. You know, it's like the Secretary General just responded to something that was in the newspaper about the same situation about Venezuela. Mm-hmm. I thought it was quite a thoughtful letter about the government's position on Venezuela. In the middle of the letter, there's some gratuitous insult hurled at me about something which has nothing to do with this letter this fellow wants to write about Venezuela. So you get the impression that there are these little traps in the mainstream media that's just left there. And as long as PLP is associated with it, the idea is to suppress the opinions. So we track, for example, our statements to see whether they actually make it into the public domain. And I would say the yield, take your newspaper apart, the yield is less than 50%. So that's why we're trying to develop our own sort of distribution system. And this will turn around, I believe, as we get closer to the election, because then the base gets more fired up. But you can't say, and I said it at the start, you can't say there is anything that this government does that goes without an answer from us.
But Mr. Mitchell, I don't see why this is a surprise, you know, because the Bahamian press has never been favorable to the PLP.
No, I wasn't saying it was a surprise. I wasn't saying it was a surprise. But what I say to people is that it goes back to what I was saying earlier about this stuff in the British and Brexit, is do not assume that the information that you get comes from a neutral platform. Otherwise, you're starting from a false premise. You know, you just, what did they say the other day? A Guardian editorial. In the editorial, it says, Marvin Dames is the most qualified Minister of National Security ever. The managing editor of The Guardian is his sister. And the editorial of the newspaper is saying, without shame, without shame. You think these people would have some shame, but they don't.
At the end of the day, it's about the economy, Mr. Mitchell. Are people happy? The government states that they see some strengthening in the economy. The central bank governor said that, by the way. With this initiative in Grand Bahama, we see certain things happening in Exuma. Is the economy improving as far as you see?
I go back to lies, damn lies, and statistics. You can get statistics from the IMF. It says 2% growth or 3% growth. You can talk about cutting back on deficits, and of course we know that's a false narrative because the deficit was on the way down. The only issue was, of course, the 2 hurricanes. So these folk, all they're boasting about right now about how the deficit is going down, et cetera, et cetera. One hurricane could throw that completely out. So that's fine, those numbers are fine and all the rest of it, and those numbers are what they are. But what is the factor on the ground? Can the lady feed her children at the end of the week? That's what we're concerned about. Are our kids getting in the education system the fairest break they can? One of the concerns I have, for example, the school that in Fox Hill, the Doris Johnson Senior School, the kids just did very well. The boys basketball team just won the government league for the secondary schools. And so as a result of it, I've gotten to talk to coaches from all of the schools about the support which the government gives in the area of sports. And I'm really keen on this because after Buddy Hield became the great success that he is in basketball, almost every kid in Doris Johnson wanted to be Buddy Hield. Now, that's a good track to be on because you finish high school, you go into university. Basketball provides you with the support for that. Now I'm told that the Nationals, for example, which go to Grand Bahama every year and are supported by the government, there's a question about whether resources are going to be provided by the government this year to support the Nationals. Yeah. But that's nonsense. This is a time when all the coaches from overseas come and watch the kids play basketball in Grand Bahama. That's the feeder program for scholarships, for these kids to get an education. And this country can't survive, education, education, education. So in terms of the policy things we're developing from the PLP side, we're saying, we have to be able to do better than that. I mean, Doris Johnson, for example, the kids have to go to various basketball games. They need a bus. For $2,500 to fix a bus, they couldn't find the resources to get $2,500 to fix a bus so that they could take the kids to the basketball games.
The Minister of Finance says that he wants to balance the budget, Mr. Mitchell, and reduce the deficit. I believe that they're cutting back in many ways. You get that?
Yeah, I understand, but you can't, it's clear now that you can't put a bean counter to be a Minister of Finance because he doesn't get it. You cannot put a bean counter to be a Minister of Finance because this country, a developing country, cannot develop unless you borrow. It's impossible. It's crazy. It's like, one day I was watching Oprah Winfrey on television, and she's saying, you mustn't max out your credit card. Here's a woman worth $2 billion telling you don't max out your credit card. But I know of a woman who lives in Roll Avenue. She maxes out everything because that's the only way she can make it at the end of the month. So there's a different reality for people. So that's the story there. So you have to have a feel for people.
Yeah. So this fiscal responsibility bill.
That bill is nonsense. It's rubbish. It isn't worth the paper it's written on. It is complete and utter rubbish. Because if you look at the provisions of it, at any point they can opt out of it. Some fancy expression they use like exigencies or so on and so forth, but it does not mean or amount to a hill of beans. What you get is some people who just got out of school with their PhDs from university, go into the IMF for the first 3 years, come down here, prescribe formulae to the Bahamas and these smaller countries about what they must do and what they mustn't do, inflicting pain on these societies. And we go and follow those prescriptions. It's lunacy.
The people in Belize say they weren't going to follow the IMF.
Well, I think that's probably the right thing to do.
So the PLP's position then is that if you are re-elected, you would put aside the Fiscal Responsibility Act?
I can't say what we'd specifically do, but I tell you what our approach is. Our approach is, when Perry Christie was the Prime Minister, IMF came and said, you have to raise taxes. And he said, no, I'm not going to raise taxes. I'm not going to do it. Because I'm not going to inflict any more taxes on the Bahamian public. I'm simply not going to do it. I am going to deal with deficit, and I'm going to deal with expansion by simply growing this economy. Now, unfortunately, others are suing now the big project that they fought against and said it was a mirage and it was a bad deal and so on and so forth.
This project?
Now they're crowing to the rafters, talking about the Baha project here in New Providence. Now they're crowing to the rafters about how successful it is and how great it is and so on and so forth. But right now, if you ask me, there's a list of things that the Bahamas ought to be doing in terms of its investment in infrastructure, in terms of investment in small business. My view is that $250 million or so should be set aside for venture capital from the government. My view is the Nassau airport needs to be expanded again because it is too small for what it does. My view is those airports in the Family Islands must be completed. It's ridiculous when you see what happens in North Eleuthera during when New Year's comes.
Or
Exuma, and my view is the platform, the digital platform on which we're operating is falling apart. Telephone calls are dropping. No one's looking at telecommunications and data in this country. It's time now to move to 5G. There's no talk about investment in that and what's going to happen in the future. All of these things will make this country competitive and grow in the future.
Mr. Mitchell.
But instead, they're still trying to litigate the 2017 election and the stupid narrative they have about corruption. And in fact, the only person who's been convicted of corruption in this country in the last 10 years is an F&M partisan.
Mr. Mitchell, on the way forward for our country, we need to, and I hear very few people talking about it, our country is underpopulated.
Yeah.
And the poorest part of our country is the area or the region that is posing the greatest security risk. That's the Southeastern Bahamas, which is being depopulated.
Yes, it's really sad. I mean, one of the things we talk about is Ragged Island. I mean, because, you know, the population was affected by the storm. There were promises to refurbish it. It's not been done. And then, of course, you know, Ackland's Crooked Island.
You know, he'd been down to Ackland's, Selena Point area, and it's an ideal location for a deep water port.
Right. I think Mr. Christie had gone down there and suggested that that ought to be done. You know, and then of course you have these people who are promoting something now in Mayaguana. But I get the impression that this is just a project to dig aggregate out of the ground and being dressed up in something, you know. So you just, after the Oban experience, you don't know whether you can actually trust these people with anything that they say. You know, it just doesn't seem to be real. It doesn't seem to, you know, sort of nothing you can touch and feel. There's just a story being spun all the time.
Should the government move ahead with Oban?
No, they should not. Our position is that that project should be abandoned. It's not a fit and proper project for the Bahamas.
It's not a fit and proper project?
No, no. All sorts of issues. I mean, it starts with a false premise because they couldn't figure out who the principals of the darn thing are. Now they say they're doing their due diligence after the fact. So that's not a fit and proper project. What is necessary, though, is Grand Bahama does need a project. And so we're watching very carefully the development of this port.
Yeah.
Now, what our concern is immediately is why is the port inside the port area and not outside the port area? Because inside the port area, you know, you have two governments operating. Yeah. You have two levels of decision making.
The PLP was putting it at the eastern end.
Outside the port, right outside the port.
And the F&M's position is to bring it in the port.
Right, at Barbary Beach. And,
yes.
and if you look at the history of this project, because, you know, we always watch to see whether or not you're going to get the proper credit for things that you do. Obviously, you're the government now, so you complete it. So it's very clever. Prime Minister gets up and says, this project spanned 3 administrations. So no one can now say that he didn't give the PLP credit because it did span 3 administrations. But that's sort of damning you with faint praise, right? So the story is, of course, that you'll remember that former Prime Minister Ingram allowed Hutchison to have a veto over whether another port could go in Grand Bahama. And he started out wanting to put the port in Williamstown, but couldn't get Hutchison to agree to waive their rights. So that was abandoned. Perry Christie came along and was able to get Hutchison to waive the right of veto, to allow the port to go in East Grand Bahama. And now you have this crew that's moving it, and they're going to put it in Barbary Beach. So that's the context around which, but what was supposed to have been central to the project is the Bahamianization or the Bahamianizing aspect of it, so that Carnival is at the core, but everything else is Bahamian, from water sports to souvenirs. You know, you just go down the list. This was supposed to be projects.
But I got to ask this because I was under the impression that this thing was going to be in the east end of Grand Bahama.
The east end would be down by McLeanstown, High Rock.
Right,
yes.
and then you will have spill off in the northern Abaco.
No, that's all changed.
In the northern Abaco, and I thought that was, you know,
It's all changed. That's going to be. It's now in the Barbary Beach area, which is inside the port area. That's where it's going to go.
Mr. Mitchell.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so very much.
Great.
We went over time, but we had to get certain questions in. Thank you so very much.
Great pleasure. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Godfrey.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching and listening to our program today, and we hope to get Mr. Mitchell back sometime soon.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, everyone.